My name is Layla Mercer, and I was 34 the Thanksgiving everything broke open. The house up in the Blue Ridge still belonged to my parents, a big, creaking place with hardwood floors and a porch that sagged a little on one side. And every holiday it smelled like smoke, citrus, and the kind of rich food that seemed to exist only to be photographed. I drove up the mountain thinking about the work projects I'd left midweek, about the flight delays that had turned my suitcase into a shapeless mass of wrinkled shirts and chargers. I walked through the door into the usual noise, laughter that rolled like a ball down a staircase, forks clinking on plates. My father telling the same story about nearly burning the stuffing when I was 6. We all fit around that dining table, like we always had, elbow to elbow, stories ricocheting off the plaster. The turkey was so fragrant it made my eyes sting, and there were pies on a sideboard with powdered sugar like snow. My half-brother Jonah sat at the head of the place with a ridiculous paper crown, phone in one hand, bite of food in the other, thumbs flying as if he were live-streaming the whole thing. My stepmother Marin flitted between chairs doling out gravy and compliments with equal enthusiasm. My father carved the bird with the kind of easy authority. People give back to the world because they can. I waited until everyone had food in their mouths, the hush of chewing acting like an unofficial truce. I smiled, a small, practiced smile, the kind that tells people you're okay while the rest of your face says something else. Hey, I said, keeping it light. Did the hospital ever send the letter with the surgery date? They all looked at me as if I'd asked whether the sun would rise tomorrow. My father chuckled, the kind of cheap laughter that slides off when a subject is uncomfortable. Oh, that note? It came last week, he said, slicing another piece of turkey as if he were trimming the edges of a much bigger lie. Marin smiled the calm, placid smile she saves for small crises. We used that money for Jonah's birthday weekend, she added, as if one thing naturally led to the next, as if life were a ledger where one expense could always borrow from another, as if consequences were fine threads that could be reknotted. Jonah's face never changed. He was scrolling his phone like he had the right to ignore whatever anyone else said. I let the knife clatter on my plate, measured the silence, and then I said, slow, steady, the way you speak when you don't want someone to accuse you of overreacting. So, you all decided who it was for before asking who actually needed. That sentence was like glass breaking. The room slammed down into silence so quickly the conversation around us was left mid-sound, like a record stuck between grooves. Marin's spoon hovered suspended. My father's face lost its sunburn and went as pale as a napkin. Jonah's jaw worked, but he didn't look up. Every holiday table is a small, high-stakes theater. Mine had been a theater of politeness and denials for years. That one quiet line made the performance crack. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. People moved because their hands insisted on work, passing potatoes, refilling wine. But the emotional motion had stopped. I slept in the living room that night with the television on low to keep me company, the remote pressed into my palm like a talisman. At some point the screen flickered off and I drifted, but not into anything restful. I woke with my phone in my hand, the glass spider web from where I dropped it when I first heard the news. I opened my banking app out of habit, like opening a medicine cabinet to check if the antiseptic had a different label. $178,000. Gone. Slashed off. The ledger like a wildfire had swept through the accounts I'd spent a decade building. That figure wasn't just numbers. It was everything I'd given up for my family when they were more convenient to save than let go. It was a decade of skipping vacations and living on takeout noodles, of taking extra shifts and letting promotions pass through my inbox unread because 10 more hours could build a buffer for somebody else. It was Jonah's tuition, his first car, the deposit on a downtown loft, because he said that's how networking happened. It was paying the Amex account that had become a social card his friends flashed like invitations to belong. 11 months. Earlier Jonah had crashed on my couch after a night out. He smelled like cheap cologne and the kind of sweat that stuck to clothes. He fell asleep like he'd been drugged by his own fatigue. His hands were splayed beside his head and his knuckles were puffy blue ridges under taut skin. He'd been complaining about pain for months. The usual story. Tendinitis from the gym. Old football bruises, but that night there was something else in the way his fingers barely curled while he slept. Because I'm a careful kind of person. Because sometimes being careful is the only thing you can control, I drew 2 vials of blood with a home kit I'd ordered. I labeled them myself, drove them to the lab before my clients were awake, and waited for the call that tightened the air around my ribs. "Lila," said the voice on the other end with an unfamiliar undertone of urgency. "Dr. Armin Halle, the rheumatologist I used to trust implicitly." He'd been Jonah's doctor for a breath of time and then drifted, but he answered. "It's aggressive rheumatoid disease. If he doesn't start biologic infusions within the next 6 to 8 months, the likelihood of permanent joint damage skyrockets." He didn't need to spell out the rest. I'd seen the x-rays, the way the cartilage looked in a man who hadn't had treatments soon enough, wheelchairs, opioids, the slow trade-off of independence from managed pain. The kind of future that gummed up every joyous thing. I didn't tell Jonah. I didn't tell my father. If I'd told them, the scene would have become 1,000 different kinds of drama. Threats, denials, arguments about responsibility. My stepmother loved an audience for everything. So I did what I always did, quietly became the solution. I set up a revocable trust in my name with one condition. The funds were for Jonah's medical care and nothing else. I called it a medical trust, wrote it in legal language that would sting a notary, and named myself trustee. Full control, tempered with a clause for emergency release should I be unreachable. It was a tiny mechanical miracle, a safety valve. I could pull if he needed immediate care. Over the next years, every bonus, every tax refund, every extra project's payment went into that trust. I stopped taking my parents' calls about renovations. I declined family outings, telling myself I was saving up for their future or for a rainy day. The balance climbed slowly, like a patient animal, until it reached the exact amount the hospital wanted upfront, $178,000 for a full year of biologic therapy, drugs and infusions, and travel, and the small, invisible things the hospital never puts a line for but that become necessary when you're protecting structure and movement. Because I traveled for work, because life has habits, and so did I included a clause. If either of Jonah's parents called the bank and said there was a medical emergency, the banker could, with a verbal confirmation and a follow-up email purportedly from me, release funds. It felt reasonable. It felt like a way to avoid a disastrous moment of delayed care if I couldn't be reached. I never imagined the clause would be exploited. I was in Denver on a late project the week the release happened. Marin called my private banker and performed grief with the kind of polished urgency that seems to come with practice. She said he was in dire straits, that I was unreachable, that he needed to be at Duke immediately. She forwarded an email that looked like something I would send, the address mimicking mine with a small, believable variant. The banker did his job the way banks are taught to do it. There was a matching clause in the trust. He saw the email. He heard the tears. The bank wired the money, and then there were pictures of a party. A peak-capped weekend at a mountain lodge. A semi-famous band flown in on a private plane. Influencers in long coats posing with champagne flutes. Fireworks over the ridge like a promise someone else had made and broken twice over. 300 ice sculptures. A chef hired because someone had a bonus card to burn. Jonah was smiling in every frame, utterly undone by the spectacle. He had no idea the sequence of zeros on someone's account had been his chance at a life that didn't hinge on opioid management. He was being celebrated by people who would forget him at breakfast. I sat on the hood of a rental car until dawn. Phone dead in my lap, feeling the lever inside me snap. 10 years of being the bank, the ambulance, the scaffolding for everyone else, and in one night I realized something fundamental. The person I'd been saving had stopped being anyone's responsibility but his own. I had been trying to stop a flood with my hands. I stopped. .2 The door rattled like a fist at the brittle edge of midnight. I opened on 3 silhouettes reeking of whiskey and entitlement. Marin shoved past me first like a woman wielding paper as a weapon, slapping a thick stack of statements onto the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "You cut off all his cards?" she demanded, voice thin and sharp. "He couldn't even buy gas today. How could you?" My father's anger came louder, the kind that had once turned me into a smaller person. The car payment bounced, repos already left a notice. "You don't get to do that to your family." Jonas stood in the doorway like someone who had learned the language of survival too well. "Sis," he said, thin and practiced. "Please, these brand deals are coming. I just need a week." I looked at each of them, and for the first time in a decade I said the only honest thing left, no. Their reaction was immediate and animal. Maren's face folded into an expression I didn't recognize. What did you say? You heard. Me, I said. No more money, no more bailing out. You wanted the party? You had it. The trust had an emergency clause and you triggered it. That money was never for fireworks. My father stepped forward, the old intimidation back in his stance. You don't get to decide this, he said. You have an obligation to keep the household afloat. You always have. That had been the story for years. I was the one who kept the house from drooping, the gift we all took for granted. I'd internalized their needs for so long I'd stopped seeing my own. Not anymore, I said. I am not your ATM, they stormed out. Jonah lingered like someone not yet fully detached, then left, hoodie up, eyes hollow. I locked the door and slept like a person who had closed the lid on a burned pot, and finally turned off the heat. 2 days later, there was a thick envelope on my doorstep. No postage. My name typed in a font that had been used for illegal notices. Inside was a petition for guardianship, an attempt by my father and Maren to have me declared incompetent. There were letters from an attorney they'd hired, a prefilled voluntary guardianship agreement with a little blue tab pointing to where my signature would go. The cover letter suggested if I signed, I would be spared the public spectacle. If I refused, they would request full guardianship, including the power to control my medical care and freeze my accounts. There was more. Fake neighbor statements about me isolating. A fabricated report from a therapist marshalling concern as though it were evidence. A printout of my bank records with highlighted transactions they called irresponsible. There was even a draft order asking a clerk to issue an emergency freeze on my accounts until a hearing could be scheduled. I called the one attorney I knew would not flinch, Claire Donahue. She told me calmly and without the indulgence of pity what I already suspected. Family members can petition for guardianship if they can show incapacity or imminent danger. A clerk may sign an emergency interim guardianship order unsurprisingly. Then evidence. Signing the voluntary document would be a trap. It would hand them legal control over my finances and my freedom. She told me to gather everything. Bank statements, texts, emails, flight logs, any proof that I was lucid, competent, and planning for my brother's medical future. She told me. The petition looked weak on its face, but that clerk sometimes granted interim orders. Sight unseen if the petitioners cried on the stand and had a lawyer who could pound their chest hard enough. We had to move fast. For 3 weeks I lived in boxes of documents. Printouts with red pen circles, bank statements annotated like maps, emails with timestamps. I practiced reciting like legal incantations. Claire subpoenaed records, pulled the notary logs, tracked IP addresses. She found the email the banker had acted on and the forwarding address that had been used to make it look like mine. She subpoenaed the pair who'd wired the money and the vendors who cashed the checks for the band and the fireworks. There was a paper trail that smelled like a party and worse, like deliberate deceit, on the day the summons arrived. In person, thrust into my hand in a supermarket parking lot by a process server with a gray suit and a tired expression, I read a list of witnesses that made my skin prickle. 11 names. Doctors I never met, neighbors who swore I'd been seen doing things I had not, coworkers who claimed I'd been hallucinating or hoarding medicine. Claire took the papers and started to arrange them on her conference table like someone setting a stage for a verdict. She used highlighters like colored flags, yellow for lies, pink for perjury, orange for things that were plainly criminal. They're playing orchestra, she said. 11 paid witnesses, same notary on the affidavits. That's not coincidence. They insisted that you had been. Courtroom the morning of the hearing felt smaller than it should have. The wood smelled like old polish and quiet desperation. Dad and Maren sat at the petitioner's table, not so much defendants as disappointed performers who'd been called for understudy. Jonah sat in the gallery pretending not to notice. Langford, their attorney, adjusted his tie and leaned forward, eyes bright with righteous fury. Claire walked in with file folders under her arm, and a face that looked like it knew how to hold fury and focus in equal measure. She moved with the kind of deliberate calm I'd always envied. She rose and addressed the clerk, Margaret Ellison, with professional deference. The first few minutes have a clarity to them that feels coincidental. The side door opens and Dr. Armin Halle steps in. His presence in the room was the hinge on which everything swung. On the stand he was quick and direct. He spoke of inflammation and early window treatment, of the narrow timeline in which biologic therapy can prevent irreversible damage. He spoke of the exact amount the hospital demanded, $178,000. He described the trust I created. He showed the court the invoices attached to the party, an itemized bill for fireworks, for band, for a private lodge, and the way his voice folded into the room when he said the trust had been accessed and the funds used not for emergency care but for a celebration. You could see it on Jonah's face. He'd been a stranger to responsibility until then, a man who liked to be seen more than he liked to see himself. The realization hit him like a literal blow. He looked at Marin and then at my father as if searching for a map he no longer owned. "You used my medical fund for a party?" he said, small and incredulous. The clerk read the affidavits back. The 11 witnesses who'd sworn I was unstable, the notary who'd stamped them, the therapist who had concern. Claire had already subpoenaed the notary's logs. She had the invoicing for the lodge. She had 3 of the 11 witnesses who had recanted under oath, admitting they'd been paid to sign what they were handed. Langford tried to object, and the clerk, calm and precise, denied him after hours that felt like both a lifetime and a single breath. The clerk, Margaret Ellison, looked up, her voice even and harder than the gavel. She found no credible basis for the claim of incapacity. She found the petition frivolous and filed in bad faith. She taxed the petitioners with court costs and ordered the record, referred to the district attorney for investigation into forgery and financial exploitation. The gallery erupted with whispers. My father and Marin sat very still. Jonah sat very still. Langford muttered and then was escorted out. They were removed from the building under their own shame. There was no heroic exit. There was only the slow, inevitable shuffling of people whose security blankets had been cut in the days that followed. Jonah's health declined in a way that opened into an awful clarity. The disease he had been flirting with for months seized him. By summertime, he couldn't grip a coffee cup without pain. By the time winter settled into the hollows of the year, his hands had stiffened into claws, and he relied on walkers and narcotic pain regimens that grew stranger and more severe. He qualified for disability, a paltry sum after premiums that barely bought him stability. The idea of independence slipped away from him like mist. My father and Marin's decline was almost the inverse. The court ordered sanctions and assessed attorney fees. The house they kept like a totem in the family name went into foreclosure. The bank chains closed on the property in the week before Christmas, and they left with boxes and a rented truck that smelled faintly of bleach and bourbon. They called once, then again, then never. Their voicemails filled with invective and entitlement, and eventually with quiet grievances that I did not answer. I sold the house in the early spring. It sold in 6 days on a cash offer to a couple from Nashville who wanted a mountain escape. I used the funds to pay the last of my student loans. I closed every joint account that still bore my name. I booked a one-way ticket east and drove down I-40 until the peaks receded in my rearview, like a memory someone else owned. There was no sense of triumph. The relief came in small, honest increments, in the way my sleep returned, unburdened by the accounting of other people's chaos. In the new apartment where every piece of furniture was mine and assembled by my own hands. In the quiet dignity of an address that didn't hold old ghost stories. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Jonah. I picture him waking up to a morning that hurts and then learning how to live in it. I imagine him going to a clinic, learning about schedules and deliveries and different pills with names like tiny promises. I picture him pausing at a window and seeing a life he did not choose but still must inhabit. The lessons I learned the hard way are simple when you let them land. Love is not a contract that obligates you to be consumed. Family is not a license to subtract your future for someone else's pleasures. Saying no doesn't always make you the villain. Often it is the first brave act of an elderly script being rewritten. When I left, I didn't look back. I drove with the windows down and sang along to songs I used to drown out with other people's problems. I changed my number. I changed the name I used at the office, answering to a middle name that felt less like a headline and more like a private answer. I took a job in a city where the streets had new names and the coffee shops didn't know my history. I breathed in spaces that hadn't been logged in someone else's expense report. I would tell anyone who has spent years propping up other people's lives this: you are allowed to stop. You do not owe your future as collateral for other people's bad choices. When you make the decision to step back, you might find you sleep better. You might find that a life built on what you need, not what everyone else demands, is not selfish but sustainable. That house, with its sagging porch and family portraits, became someone else's mountain retreat. The turquoise mailbox, a new symbol on a road I no longer drove. In the mornings when I wake up in my apartment and the city outside is a soft hum rather than a chorus of expectations, I find the shape of myself again in small things. The way my hands make coffee, the precise way I fold a shirt, the rhythm of email replies sent on my own clock. I carry the memory of that Thanksgiving like a scar that shows how far I have healed. I carry the knowledge that I did what I could, but I tried to protect the person who had been entrusted to me as quietly as I could in the only way I knew how. I also carry the clarity that if love is a weight that breaks you, then it was never love to begin with. The last time I drove past the mountain there were pink dogwoods and the sky, the color of a promise I no longer needed to keep. I rolled the window down and let the cool air sweep through the car, and for the first time in a long time, I was simply moving forward.